way of doing things after having lots of, for lack of a better word, just outright failures, a lot of my programs. So I'm very now into Scrum at Scale and the scaling world, and excited to be here from DC and talking to everybody about the new Scrum Guide.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Brian Levy, you think you could top that?
I don't know if I can top it this early in the morning. But I'll introduce myself. My name is Brian Levy. I'm actually a Scrum at Scale trainer and a consultant. I've been doing Scrum since about 2003. I can tell you right up front that Scrum affects every aspect of my life. It actually saved my marriage. And we'll get into that story a long time, some other time. But my whole family participates in Scrum, participates in Agile. We have a Scrum board in the kitchen. I started out as a Unix system administrator, and I've done all the different roles from administration to development to architecture to analyst to project manager to methodologist. And so I cover all the different perspectives, and hopefully that'll help us make a lively conversation today. So happy to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you all. And if attendees were able to piece that together, there's quite a bit of diversity of thought here. Dave is very much about focusing on government and making government more agile, and that includes his offering his expertise in not only Scrum but also Scrum at Scale and SAFe. Brian, being in Silicon Valley, focuses on enterprise delivery of agility with very similar frameworks, but many years of experience in training and coaching that include SAFe, Scrum at Scale, and Scrum as well. And Brian and I actually met many years ago and have been colleagues working in prior companies, prior organizations, working on transformations that involved the former. So you're getting a lot of different perspectives from an experience standpoint, and we wanted to come together and share our thoughts and our observations and finding in relation to the new Scrum Guide. So Scrum turned 25 this year. Happy birthday, Scrum! Right. So 25 years ago, this framework that has in many ways changed how we work, but also how we live, even our families, to Brian's point, might be using it in some cases. And to honor that, Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schraber got together and put a revision forward that evolved the Scrum Guide since its 2017 revision. So it had been 3 years since it was revised last. And this is a major revision with what I perceive to be some of the more dramatic changes it had in many years in the last at least a few revisions that it had. So we wanted to share what some of those might be and what that looks like from a scaling standpoint and how it affects those. With the Scrum Guide being for those of you that are not familiar with the Scrum, a brief introduction is in order. So the Scrum Guide is essentially a 19-page /that, and now let's make it 14-page document that guides Scrum, as the name implies. It is where the rules of the game are. And we look at it in the way that, hey, this is our main guide, and now it's up to us to fit our practices and techniques in it. By the fact that Scrum is a framework, we need to understand that framework, that scaffolding, before we start to put the in the details into the building, so to speak, to stay with that scaffolding metaphor. So with this new revision, we're looking at some significant changes that could potentially impact how we think about that framework, how we think about that scaffolding. And in doing so, what we'd like to put forward is the fact that the Scrum Guide is intentionally incomplete. It is meant to be a general document. And by the way, am I sharing? I just want to confirm that I am sharing and you're seeing my share. Yeah? Okay, very good. Thank you. The Scrum Guide is a guide that is meant to be, that is meant to address some of the main rules of the game with the purpose that we follow the intent of the document and not so much the word by word. We tend to spend a lot of time dissecting what does the word mean and why was it put in there, when in actuality, from conversations that we have, Brian, Dave, and I have been lucky enough to collaborate with Dr. Sutherland, Jeff Sutherland, the co-creator of Scrum and the editor of this document that we're reviewing today, the Scrum Guide. And the key takeaway is that the Scrum Guide is not a prescriptive document. The Scrum Guide is meant to be a guide. So in order to move away from this notion that everything that's in there must be followed according to the letter of the law, the new guide, the 2020 guide, removes some of the wording that was causing some prescription. So one of the key elements of this change is that the new guide is less prescriptive now. It actually is a 14-page document that removes some of the things. For those of you that are familiar with the previous guide, for example, the 3 sample questions that were suggested as examples in the retrospective are not there now. That is so that we don't get hung up on running a retrospective with such specific type of wording, right? The idea that we had the birth of Scrum revolved around software development, and therefore the language in the Scrum Guide was very IT specific. But with the success of Scrum, with the growth that Scrum has had over the past 2 decades and a half, it is now being used in other areas. It is being used in HR, it's being used in sales. We're seeing it used in many, many different contents. And because of that, we wanted to move away from it being language specific to some of those roots, things like that included testing and systems, so that we're not hung up on the fact that, hey, this is a framework for IT, but rather a method of working. And I think, Brian, you can attest to that. You've been involved in some implementations of Scrum that go beyond software and how that language can get in the way. You want to share some thoughts around that?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm very proud to actually be able to say that I was in the first non-IT usage of Scrum in nationwide insurance with the standard underwriting team, which is about as far away as you can get from software development as possible. And in that, the output, the products that we were creating were actually a new rating system for how they did their underwriting. So here's how we actually price their policies, what they have to do every so often. And so opening this up and changing language actually has made a huge impact, making others that use Scrum in different modes, from TV production to radio to research sciences to sales teams, and making them feel a part of the Agile movement. So we're happy for that change.
And I know that when we were collaborating in a past life at our previous employer, dealing with thousands and thousands of people, we worked with HR in influencing how they actually work together. We actually went to HR with the intent of getting them to be more friendly to the talent that we brought into the organization. And later on, HR said, wait a minute, what you guys are doing here is actually interesting and we can use it. So they began using Scrum themselves.
I'll say that the most interesting usage at our previous employer was the legal team. So they used to actually create legal documents kind of at the end of the process. And then by introducing the Scrum, they actually say, well, let's take a risk-based approach, figure out the biggest risks, and then sprint by sprint, actually put in legal language and agreements around each of the risks. And so they actually finish the legal document, which cut the throughput time, by 50%.
Dave, how are you seeing government adopt Scrum in other areas that might not be specific to software engineering?
Yeah, it's certainly getting more popular. And I'll just say from the start, I think while there are certain pockets in government that are probably on par with the private sector or close, we are in general behind. So there's still plenty of people just embracing Scrum as a great way to do software development. But that said, we're probably not as forward-leaning as Brian's clients, right? Silicon Valley, or even Cisco nationwide. But we have seen cases where, and this is getting very popular, there's a bunch of folks I follow on LinkedIn who now in the military has embraced Scrum, not just as doing software, and the military does a ton of software integrated with hardware, but as a way for the people defending us, how do they interact on lots of different things? So it may be, how do they prioritize? So we know that, Scrum and agility goes beyond just day-to-day. What do you do when you get into the trenches? It's a lot about prioritization. It's working on the right things. So I'm seeing local governments, actually, Brian, right out your way, San Jose, the government of San Jose, just had some conversations with a few folks out there during COVID. They did some big room planning. For those of you who don't know, it's a term sometimes we use in the Scaled Agile framework and SAFe. They brought a bunch of their leaders into the room where before it would have taken them weeks or even months to go through and replan. What do we do now that COVID is a top priority? How do we reprioritize all these 50 other things we're doing because we got limited resources, right? They didn't get new money at this point. And within a couple hours, they were able to use some of our some tools that I know at least Ernesto and I use, some online tools and some planning methods we'll do in Agile quite often to replan how they're going to use their budget for 2021 to try to save lives. So there's a lot at stake. They're certainly getting it in other areas. And before I hand it back to you though, Ernesto, I'll say this goes to what we're really getting at here. When you talk about intent versus wording, the intent really, and I don't know if, I'd have to ask Dr. Sutherland if they meant this when they wrote the guide originally. This is really about building high performing teams. It's very little to do with software, right? How do you build a team that interacts effectively and inspects and adapts? And when you start thinking about it that way, it's very clear that you can apply this pretty much to anything that requires a team of humans. Back to you, Ernesto.
That's a great, and you talked about planning, and great segue, because part of what the new version of the Scrum Guide focuses on is this concept of commitment. It's reintroducing commitment into the Scrum Guide. Now, we said that the guide has been shrunken down to 14 pages, less prescriptive, and it took the time to dedicate a section to this area of commitment. To do this, it actually, in a very clever way, found a home for some of these things that we always use and discuss and had in Scrum, such as the sprint goal and the definition of done. Well, what are they? They're not quite an artifact, but they're needed, they're necessary. So the Scrum Guide needed to find a home for these things. And it did so by creating or adding an area that it calls commitment. And there are 3 commitments now in Scrum. The top level commitment is the product goal. And the product goal is synonymous with the product vision. So Brian, I know that this is a dear topic to you, because now we finally have a place where that product vision can directly connect to the planning and also to the execution, right? Something that in portfolio management is crucial. And we've always struggled with how can we connect the two, because we knew what to do, but it wasn't part of the framework that obligated individuals to do so. Now this is a part of the rules of the game. Okay? The second commitment is the sprint goal. And that sprint goal is essentially meant to address the fact that we are committed to executing the product backlog. That's important. Why is that important? Because there were instances starting to become more and more common where the developers were working on things that were in their interests, regardless of what was in the product backlog. Now, we knew that there was always a commitment to work on the top priority of the product backlog, but how do you hold the developers accountable to that? Well, now the sprint goal is that part which holds the developers accountable to work on the items related to the actual goals that we are agreeing to execute during the sprint. I'll also tell you that at Agile Genesis, some of you have been very helpful in participating in our data gathering and surveys. And those teams that have sprint goals defined at the beginning of their sprint tend to complete their sprints more successful in rate than those that don't. In other words, teams that don't craft a sprint goal during sprint planning tend to carry over stories or product backlog items more so than teams that don't. So the sprint goal is the main way to keep everyone consistent and also for the team to be accountable to delivering around the product backlog. And the third one is the definition of done. We finally have a home for the definition of done. The definition of done is a form of commitment. And it's a form of commitment to the quality of the product increment. If we agree that when we are delivering the increment, it has these quality checkpoints, we are delivering high quality items, presumably, assuming we have a well-crafted definition of done. So a new addition here is the product backlog and the grouping of these items. They come together under this family called the commitment family, right? Dave, we still have you. You moved boxes on me, so I just want to make sure that you were still there. Yeah.
I am still here.
Excellent, excellent. The other change that is significantly impacting how our teams are thought of in a Scrum implementation is this idea that we no longer have a development team as a name. Now you might say, oh, that's just mincing words, Ernesto, but it does make a difference because part of what the Scrum guy was addressing in this case was this us versus them mentality that had become an anti-pattern in some places. So it is now that we have the Scrum Master, the product owner, and everyone else is a developer in that team. So there's no development team as a sub team of teams, right? So the term has now changed to developers. I will tell you that there was a lot of debate and a lot of conversations about removing the word developer, period. But it had become so ingrained in Scrum that it actually would have been quite significant of a change or disruption in change. So the community took sides to that, and the word developer was left, but the team was removed. Brian, have you seen an instance in your implementation where that has created some conflict between perhaps the product owner and the development team, and where this can help in a scaling environment?
I have seen so many instances where that's been the case. But I'll tell you that the biggest thing I see from project to project, from team to team, organization to organization, is people still carried into Scrum the idea that their skill set was their role, right? So if I'm a QA person, that was my skill set. Then they went to the team and they actually took that in and said, all right, well, this says a development team, but I'm not part of the development team. I'm QA. So I'm not subject to all this stuff, right? I'm a business analyst, right? So this says a development team. And I think that the clarity that wording does by saying, hey, anyone who is developing the product, you're part of the team, and you're not acting as a PO, you're not acting as a Scrum Master. So all the rest of you are one team, you're sharing the word. and so your developers, I think that adds a lot more clarity, and it makes it a lot more inclusive for the rest of the team.
Yeah, yeah. And it also maybe even takes us into a less prescriptive aspect of the approach that we take when we're crafting how to create those cross-functional members, right?
Absolutely. And I think we're moving into a world now in Scrum where people are really going to take the whole concept of being T-shaped, where you have multiple skills, even though you may be a master of one or two. People are going to take that more seriously, where you're going to actually go in and, hey, some testing needs to get done. My primary skill set might not be testing. In my previous life before Scrum, I may have been called a business analyst, but testing needs to be completed. So I'm going to help out with testing so we can actually get things to done, right? I think people are going to adopt that a lot more than they have in the past.
I hope so. Yes. Yes. So the third one, Dave, you and I spoke extensively about this, right? Because this one's a tough one. The word servant leader to describe the Scrum Master changed to leaders that serve. Talk about, whoa, isn't that just wordsmithing at this point? And it took some time for me to really get into the intent, not the word in this case, right? The idea that Scrum Masters had become a pair of hands that were intended to be servants in Scrum. And that created for some significant anti-pattern, some unhealthy behavior in Scrum implementation. So now, by putting the words in that, hey, a Scrum Master is expected to be a leader. And by the way, that leader serves. Now there's accountability to improve the team. And I might not be doing it as much justice. From the conversations we had with Sutherland, he really went deep into this in how him and Ken went back and forth in trying to get that that secretarial mindset out of the Scrum Master. Can you help me a little with that conversation?
Yeah, well, and for anybody who's been a Scrum Master, right, I'm guessing you felt like the secretary of the team from time to time, right? Go enter these Jira tickets, Trello, whatever you're doing. Hey, can you just type this up for us? And that's clearly, look, you know, I would still argue, I think Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, Dr. Sutherland, who created Scrum and updated the guide, you know, I think there is still an element where people could argue, yes, it's wordsmithing. Yes, it's a minor tweak. This is where, Ernesto, you talked about the intent. And that's, I think, really the key. The intent here is to make sure we don't treat our Scrum Masters as the secretary of the team. They have an important job. What we found, right, what Scrum is all about is that you have to focus on continuous improvement. You have to focus on facilitation. It's so important. Think about this. Before Scrum came into being, how many teams had one person dedicated to continuous improvement? By making somebody dedicated on the role, Scrum is saying this is so important. If we improve our performance 1 or 2% every single sprint, we will get, compounding, right? We'll get orders of magnitude better. So I think that's the really important thing, the intent, that when you look at your teams today, you can ask yourself, have we relegated our Scrum Master to just a facilitator, to just a note taker, to just an impediment logger? Or are we spending time, are they really helping us focus on metrics and looking at inspection and adaptation as an absolutely key part of the role? And Jeff, Dr. Sutherland, in one of the calls that Ernesto mentioned, he was very clear. They are accountable for improving team performance. So if your performance is not improving sprint over sprint, this is an area for your Scrum Master where they need to look and make sure that they're doing really the core part of the role.
Yeah, I always like to say, I have tough conversations with organizational leaders during transformations, and oftentimes I say, well, we can have a Scrum Master service 10 teams, right? Because that's how many meetings someone's able to schedule, sort of doing the math from that backwards. And I would say, well, I don't need a Scrum Master to schedule meetings. My Outlook has a smart feature that can do that, right? The real value here is in that team improvement and observing and partnering with the team to move that effectiveness and efficiency forward in a very involved manner, right? And that puts the leader in the role now in a way that wasn't there before. Excellent, thank you. We're at the half point, a little over the half point. Just want to point everyone to the chat. There's a lot going on with questions and comments as well. Thank you. Keep them coming. Dave, myself, and Brian are monitoring that, depending on who's at the wheel. So if you have any questions, please type them, and we'll try to address them by writing or verbally as well. Okay. The fourth major change was this additional word of being self-managing rather than self-organizing as teams. There's an underlying current in the new Scrum Guide, and it has to do with accountability and commitment. If we look at the previous examples we provided, or some of the major changes that included the commitments, that included the leader aspect of the Scrum, Scrum Master. And now there's this concept of being self-managing teams instead of self-organizing. And we said, well, why? What's the difference between self-organizing and self-managing? And both Ken and Dr. Sutherland mentioned, hey, there was a lot of sort of relaxed approach by the developers in terms of delivering the items that were expected to be delivered. The managing aspect puts ownership in that delivery. You are not expected to just coordinate how you do the work. You're expected to own that work. As a manager, you are an individual or a set of individuals responsible for bringing that work forward. You are passionate and committed to delivering the increment. So self-managing teams is more appropriate to self-organizing. And again, it sounds like just semantics, but in trying to make it more truthful to how organizations are utilizing the commitment level from not just the Scrum Master, from the product owner, and now also from the actual developers and that are in that team. Okay? So from self-organizing to self-managing. And one of my favorites, we've introduced the why. The why was implied in the Scrum Guide. And what do I mean when we say the why? Well, during sprint planning, we had two topics, right? And those two topics were the what and the how. But we never really made room to talk about the why are we doing this? And the why is the guiding question that arrives at the actual sprint goal that we are expected to craft every time. So without asking that question or allocating time for that discussion, it was difficult to craft a set of items that had a united purpose behind it. The why are we doing this? So now the sprint planning session has the what, the why, and the how, right? So that is a major change, one that I was very happy to see, because it forces the conversation around the sprint goal and the execution. And I know, Brian, you were very happy to see this in there as well, because it is a mechanism to allow us to connect that portfolio high-level item that is the vision, product goal, and now we're talking about the why that allows us to craft the sprint.
Absolutely. I'm a big Simon Sinek fan, and I believe in starting with why. And you want to make sure that the overall outcome the goals that you have from an organizational perspective are actually being connected through the product goal that's been set. And you want to make sure that not only are they aligned, but the sprint goal that you're working on should be a subset of the product goal. So there should be alignment all the way through. And that makes sure that piece by piece, sprint by sprint, you're actually accomplishing the strategy for the entire organization.
Yeah. Yeah, it's music to the ear for those of us that deal with scaling on a regular basis, because everything starts at that vision and we need to connect it to the why. Excellent. And the last item, before we go into scaling, we have a section as well that focuses on scaling that we want to call out, is the introduction, or the admission, as I like to say, of lean thinking into the Scrum Guide. I was very, very happy to see this. I come from a lean management background. I'm passionate about how that is able to improve how organizations work by the lean concepts, including waste elimination. And I've always or have always recognized that Scrum is founded on the lean principles. And now that a framework that allows us to create any product or service in an effective way has the ability to help in a way that we've come full circle, any industry, including manufacturing. The Scrum Guide takes the time to recognize that, hey, what we do is founded is rooted on lean thinking. And now we have the opportunity to open that further into practices and techniques that take us into the lean management realm, right? Such as waste elimination, for example. So very happy to see that word being introduced, and number one, providing the recognition to that, but also to allow us to use some of those lean management techniques that have long been suggested practices, right? And with that, I want to go into some of the scaling aspects, some of the scaling factors. How does this now apply to our scaling world, where many of us are now practicing Scrum beyond a single team? In fact, I'd like to run a little unofficial survey here, and I will ask folks on the call, how many of you are scaling today? How many teams are you involved with, whether it be at the leadership level or working with other teams when it comes to implementing Scrum? So I'm going to put a question in here that just says number of teams in the chat as a delineator. And if you could take a second to just provide us with a number, how many approximate teams are you involved with, whether it's collaborating with other teams in your organization, which makes you part of a scaling effort, or whether you're leading that, or whether you're going into a transformation that has multiple teams. And I'm not a betting man, but in this case, I'm going to wager a safe bet that very few of us are dealing with individual single team implementations anymore. Scrum has now evolved into the mainstream, if you will, in a very good way. So many of us are now trying to amplify the benefits that we get from a single team throughout the organization. So I see that many of you, we have 4 teams, 3 teams, 10 plus, 30 plus, 2, 3, not anyone with 1 so far. And here's a realization. If you have more than 1 team, you are scaling already, right? The fact that you need to coordinate 2 teams, and that the benefit of a single team must be amplified times 2 or times 3, depending on how many teams you have, in a proportional way, is a key element. So let's talk about some of that. And to do this, I'd like to, we're going to focus for this particular slide on SAFe. Dave, would you like to walk us through this? Yeah.
Sure. And I think, Ernesto, you talked about lean in the prior slide, and this is a perfect segue into SAFe. One of the things, our Scaled Agile framework, for those of you who may be less familiar, as Ernesto said, it looks like lots of you are already dealing with multiple teams. So many of you have probably heard of SAFe, the Scaled Agile framework. it is probably, according to most surveys, the leading way of organizing multiple Scrum teams today. They've done I think, a great job of getting freely available information out on the internet and marketing. And that's, you know, a lot of people argue back and forth on whether SAFe is great or not. We're not going to talk about that today. I think, like a lot of things, I call it a tool in your toolbox. We've certainly used it successfully, and other scaling frameworks as well. So with that, SAFe, I think, recognized from the start and had principles that lean was a key consideration. They had what they call the house of lean. So some of the things that are in the new Scrum guide, I think they did a great job of calling out as critical considerations even before this update, years and years ago, maybe as early, I'd have to look back at the versions of SAFe, but as early as 2011. But here are some areas, right? We've got to wait. SAFe has been clear. The Scale Agile guys have been clear that they don't always follow the Scrum guide one for one. And I'll give you, for example, I've helped develop a few SAFe exams. And I'm actually in the middle of doing the newest SAFe Scrum Master exam right now with Scale Agile. And they continue to call what in the Scrum guide is called the daily Scrum, the daily stand-up. Perfectly fine, you know, but they admit they're not trying to be 100% consistent with SAFe. So, but here's some things that, you know, I'm promoting to them and hoping that you'll consider. I'll remind you too that just like Scrum, SAFe is not so overly prescriptive that you can't decide on your own that you're going to change. So for example, in the new Scrum guide, they took out the 3 questions that many of us are very familiar with. What have you done yesterday to work towards a sprint goal? What do you plan to do today to work towards a sprint goal? And are there any things in your way, any impediments? So I think Ernesto and myself, I'm guessing Brian would all probably still agree, those are great questions. But many teams have found as they've moved on, I don't really need that. That sounds more like a status report. What I really need, the most important question to me on most of my teams is actually the third one. Because I have a lot of self-organizing, self-motivated teams. Are there impediments in your way? I might go into a Scrum, especially for a mature team, and ask only that question, right? And that is perfectly fine. I think the new Scrum guide makes that clear. I'm hopeful that SAFe will take some of that into account. But even if they don't, I'd say, oops, and Ernesto, I think we lost your slides, or at least I did. But hopefully they'll take that into account. But even if they don't, that's something that you can use today to help. And let me bring up, so I have the slides here because I have lost Ernesto's. I don't know if that was just me. The product goal. Again, I would argue here, this is one of those things, SAFe probably has less to go because, right, in some ways, at a team level, what they were addressing when Scrum added in the guide the product goal is something that again, SAFe does a pretty good job of. They've got PI planning, and they've got the concept of epics. They've got PI planning objectives that we measure every PI. So the product goal, I'd argue, is kind of wrapped up in there. So I don't think you really need a whole lot of changes, but that might be something you call out during PI planning, right? Instead of just PI objectives, hey, here's even our iteration goal, which is kind of the culmination of those PI program increment objectives, we call them, say. And that link that Ernesto talked about, that's absolutely key. So each time that we do iteration planning, again, SAFe calls, we call it a sprint in Scrum. SAFe prefers to call even our team level activities for the sprint, they prefer to call that an iteration. So when we go into iteration planning, talking about that product goal, very useful. And finally, SAFe still has the dichotomy that I think Brian talked about. SAFe has a team within a team. The development team, or actually I think they call it the Agile team, and sometimes they're clear that it includes the Scrum Master and the product owner. other times in some of the literature, I can tell you a few of us have noticed places where like, ooh, that seems to make it sound like there's a separate team. We really want to get across the feel of one team. So again, if you're using SAFe today, you don't have to wait for them. That can be something that if you're feeling that dichotomy on your teams, to go back and say, look, SAFe is really built on top of Scrum in a lot of ways. They make very clear that Scrum teams are the engine that make it go. So consider clarifying to your teams that, look, it is one team, Scrum Master, product owner, and developers are all part of that team. I think, Ernesto, for me, those were the big ones.
Yeah, and I think those are great points. In some ways, SAFe did make a change. I believe it was in 5.0 that could have anticipated some of the change in relation to making it one team, where they had specialty roles, right? Those roles were the ones that you mentioned, and then the rest is the team.
Yeah, they did talk about it. I'm literally going through the exam stuff now, and I will tell you there's still some stuff in the exam that seems to separate out the Scrum Master and the product owner as if they were not part of the team, which again, I think the SAFe guys are great about updating their material. They'll get there. Excellent.
Thank you for sharing that, Dave. And then for purposes of offering a contrast, as well as some consistent underlying themes in terms of how it impacts scaling, we also wanted to take a look at Scrum Scale. And Brian, I think you might want to speak to some of these as well.
Yeah, I just love to point out that there's some wording, some small wording changes. Again, I think the intent was already in there for 2017 Scrum Guide, but some wording choices is in the new guide that may lead us to a little bit different conclusions. And so I've pointed out some of those that are on the slide here, and I'm gonna pick out a quote. The Scrum artifacts and the progress toward agreed goals must be inspected frequently and diligently to detect potential undesirable variables or problems. And really, when we talk about this inspection, goals, agreed upon goals, right? We're stressing this look at goals and outcomes. And as we talked about before, we're in an age where you want to break down the goals from your strategy that are at a high level, and there should be alignment. So that overall strategic goal that comes from the vision that the company sets out, right, which is a component of Scrum at Scale, is broken down into the prioritized scale backlog list, right, which is broken down further into the actual goals that come out from a scaled increment that we want to look at. And that's broken down into a sprint goal, right? So these goals should all connect. And there needs to be a little bit of attention. I haven't seen as much attention as I'd like in the industry of having roles like the product owner actually look to see that and analyze to see that there's alignment all the way up to the higher levels, right? And so I think that that's what is highlighting here is that alignment that should take place. And there's one more thing I want to point out that is a wording change inside of the Scrum Guide. If you look at the next bullet here, it says to help with inspection, Scrum provides cadence in the form of its 5 events, right? So each of the events that are within Scrum are geared towards making sure that you have the goal in mind and you're inspecting to see how far along you are with the goal, right? So it's all goal outcome based, right? And too often, I think in our implementations of Scrum, we've been very focused on producing outputs. We've been focused on making sure that we produce this product increment, but not so interested and focused on the outcome that we want for our stakeholders who are going to use that output. And just having that shift in focus may change some of the characteristics that we actually put inside of our product increment of the things we produce. And that point is further highlighted. If you look at that last bullet here, right, where it says with Scrum, important decisions are based on the perceived state of its three formal artifacts. And what I want to point out, if you think about what a state is a set of conditions, right? It's some characteristics. And those characteristics, those conditions, if you think about what types of speech describe characteristics and conditions, you're talking about adjectives describing a noun. And what this really highlights with that wording change is that when you actually are developing your sprint goal should not be a verb, right? It shouldn't be things that you're doing because you're looking for a state, right? So inside of that sprint goal, you should craft it in a way where you're describing with adjectives, here's the characteristics that I'm actually going to have for this thing, the noun that I'm actually creating,
I love
right?
that.
That gets you to a whole different perspective, right? Now you're really describing what the end outcome is because it's a state, right? And this is completely a different paradigm change that I see most Scrum teams actually embarking on. Most Scrum goals I see, sprint goals I see, they're all verbs, right?
Yes.
How do you two feel about this?
That's a great pickup. I love that. I never thought about it in that sense. Yeah, from the output perspective and how we think about it influences how we create that goal that is so essential for the teams to move forward with the increment.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you that, in my practice, what I've tried to do is make sure we've redefined what we mean by strategy. Because people think about strategy as this high level thing that only the people at the top of the company actually set. But strategy is all the actions, all the plans that everyone does at all levels in order to obtain an outcome, obtain a goal, right? And in that light, the Scrum team actually implements strategy. And that's why this hierarchical link between the vision, and the outcomes that you want at the top of the company and breaking those things down all the way through down to the Scrum team is so important. We need to actually really specify and let our teams know you're connected, you're implementing the company, the organization strategy, right? And that's super uplifting once they can actually see that. Not now, the morale of the team is really engaged when you can actually make that connection, right? And I make sure that when we actually launch sprint planning, and hopefully you see that change inside of the Scrum guide, where it actually specifies in sprint planning topic 1 that stakeholders are often invited to it. I actually make sure with my teams that there is a business stakeholder from higher up in the organization who actually indicates that connection. You're not just building this feature, right? You're doing this valuable thing for our customers. And the whole perspective of the team is entirely different once they can see that connection, right? You got to start with why.
And we come back full circle, right? We're leading by intent rather than by the specific items.
Absolutely.
Excellent. I want to highlight upcoming event with Scrum at Scale. Dave, would you like to speak to the upcoming class for government for those that are interested in specialty domain in the government area?
Sure. Yeah. Even if you're not in government, you're more than welcome to attend. But one of the things Ernesto and I, we do teach a class. Again, I'm very passionate about trying to help the government save tax dollars. So if you are interested in Scrum at Scale, for attending this or some of our other webinars, we do give you an additional 15% off. So if you'd like that discount, please just, I think Ernesto will make our email addresses available, or you can reply back to the group, to the meetup group, and we will give you a code for that if you are interested. It's you can find some basic information about Scrum at Scale out on the web, but it is Dr. Sutherland's basically answer to scaling that, again, is probably less prescriptive than something like SAFe is.
Thank you, Dave. With that, we are out of time, but want to wish Scrum a happy birthday and also give you the opportunity to download a new Scrum guide, scrumguides.org, if you haven't done so already. We'll have some more of these. We could, of course, speak to these topics for days. It's part of what we're passionate about, and we love connecting the community around these. So we'll have an opportunity to do it again. Thank you all for attending. See you soon. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, everyone.